Jeremiah Finch grabbed Clementine Caldwell by the wrist in front of the entire Sunday congregation and dragged her up the church steps like she was livestock at auction. "This," he announced, loud enough for the whole street to hear, holding her arm up as if presenting damaged goods, "is what a man gets when he can't pay what he owes." The laughter that followed was the kind that leaves marks. If that moment made your blood boil, good. It should. Because what happened next in that church doorway is the kind of story people in this town are still talking about decades later. A story about two people the world threw away and what they built from the wreckage. Stay with us until the very end, because this one doesn't go where you think it will. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now so you never miss stories like this one. Drop a like, and tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to Oakhaven. What? The morning it all fell apart started the way most disasters do, quietly. Clementine Caldwell had been awake since before dawn, the way she always was, because sleep had never come easy in a house where you knew you were a problem waiting to be solved. She sat at her work table near the window of their small home on the edge of Oakhaven's main road, fingers moving through a piece of pale blue cotton she'd been hired to hem for Mrs. Alderman's daughter. The work was fine. The payment was barely enough to cover a week's flour, but it was hers, and she did it with the kind of careful attention that people who have been told they're worthless often pour into the only thing they're allowed to be good at. She heard her father before she saw him. Walter Caldwell had a way of entering a room like a weather system, heavy, unpredictable, and always carrying the potential for damage. He was a big man who had once been strong, before the drinking ate the muscle off him and left behind only the size and the temper. His boots on the floorboards made the cups rattle on their hooks. "You're up," he said, not warmly. "I'm always up," Clementine said without looking at him. "Seems crooked on this collar. I have to redo it before Mrs. Alderman comes at noon." "Put it down." She looked up then. His face was doing the thing it did when something had already been decided and he was only now getting around to telling her. His jaw was set. His eyes couldn't quite meet hers. "Papa, this is paid work. I can't just—" "I said put it down, Clementine." She set the fabric on the table, folded her hands, waited. He pulled out a chair, sat down across from her, and the chair groaned under him in a way that seemed appropriate. He put his hands flat on the table between them, the way a man does when he's about to explain something he knows is indefensible. "Finch came by last night," he said. Clementine felt the air change in the room. Jeremiah Finch was the name of every bad conversation she'd had with her father over the past 2 years. The man owned the bank, half the business leases in Oakhaven, and what felt like the deed to their family's dignity. "How much?" she asked. "More than you can imagine." "How much, Papa?" He told her. The number sat between them like something dead on the table. She did the math without meaning to. Counted the work she'd taken in, the late nights, the ruined eyes from stitching in bad light, the pride she'd swallowed every time she delivered a garment to a woman who wouldn't quite look her in the face while paying her. She'd spent 4 years trying to help him claw back from this debt. 4 years of pretending she didn't hear the things women said about her in the dry goods store. 4 years of lowering her head when men made jokes at her back. The math didn't work. It never had. "What did you tell him?" she asked. Walter looked at his hands. "Papa, what did you tell Jeremiah Finch?" "I told him I'd bring you to the Sunday gathering." The words landed soft, almost polite, which was somehow the worst part. "And what," Clementine said very slowly, "does Jeremiah Finch want with me at the Sunday gathering?" Her father stood up. He walked to the window. He looked at the road outside like he was hoping someone would come along and interrupt them. "He wants to make a public arrangement," he said, "in front of the town. He says if you agree to work in his household as a domestic, he'll forgive the full debt." Clementine stared at her father's back. "Work in his household." "That's what he said." "He has 3 servants, Papa. He doesn't need a 4th. "Clementine, he wants to humiliate us." Her voice was steady, which surprised her. "He wants to stand up in front of the whole town and make an example of us. That's what this is." Walter turned around, and she saw on his face the confirmation she hadn't wanted. He wasn't going to argue with her. He wasn't going to deny it. He was simply going to make her go. "The debt is real," he said, "and I can't pay it. Then we lose the house and we figure something out." "There's nothing to figure. He holds the lien on everything. The house, the equipment, the lot your mother left you, everything." He said her mother's name like it was a card he was playing. "This is the only way." Clementine picked up the blue cotton cloth. She started folding it. Her hands shook only a little. "Then I'll go," she said quietly. "But don't pretend this is something other than what it is." The Sunday gathering in Oak Haven wasn't a religious service exactly. It was a social institution, which in frontier Colorado territory was something far more powerful. It happened on the steps of the largest building in town, which happened to be the old church. People brought food. Children ran between legs. The men discussed crops and cattle prices. The women arranged and rearranged the social order of the town in ways that wouldn't be acknowledged but would be deeply felt for months afterward. Everyone came. That was the point. Clementine had dressed herself carefully that morning, and she hated herself a little for it. She'd worn her best dress, the dark burgundy one she'd made herself, fitted well because she knew how to cut for her own shape, even if no seamstress in town had ever offered to make anything for her without at least one comment about the yardage required. She'd put her hair up, she'd pinched color into her cheeks. She'd told herself it was dignity. She suspected it was armor. They arrived together, she and her father, and she watched his eyes dart around looking for Jeremiah Finch the moment they reached the crowd. She kept her own eyes straight ahead. She'd learned a long time ago that looking around gave people the opportunity to catch your gaze and fill it with something you didn't want to see. She heard the whispers start before they'd taken 10 steps. The Caldwell girl. Heard the debt was enormous. Never did understand why Walter thought he could. She kept walking. Jeremiah Finch was standing near the church steps, and he was the kind of man who occupied space the way a storm does. Everyone near him was slightly bent in his direction, adjusting. He was perhaps 50, broad through the shoulders, dressed in a suit that announced money without being vulgar about it. He had a full beard going silver, and pale eyes that didn't warm when he smiled. He smiled when he saw them. "Walter," he said, extending his hand to her father. He shook it the way you shake the hand of someone who owes you something. Too long, too firm, eyes holding contact past the point of comfort. Then he looked at Clementine. "Miss Caldwell," he said. "Mr. Finch," she said. There was a moment where she thought, foolishly she would later understand, that perhaps it would be handled with some minimal discretion. A quiet word, a brief acknowledgement, something that at least pretended at civility. Then Finch raised his voice. "Friends," he said, turning to address the crowd, and the easy authority in his voice made people turn and pay attention the way they'd been trained to do their whole lives. "I want to speak to a matter of some concern before we begin this morning." Clementine felt the crowd shift, felt the attention come toward her like a wave she couldn't outrun. "Many of you know that Walter Caldwell has been carrying a debt to my bank for several years now." Finch turned to look at her father, who was staring at the ground. "Walter is a good man in many ways, but he's not a practical one, and the debt has grown to a point where it cannot be ignored." He paused. "Now, Walter has proposed something unusual by way of settlement." He turned to Clementine, and she understood then, with the specific clarity of humiliation, that there had never been any offer of domestic work. That story had been her father's invention, or his cowardice, or both, because what Finch said next had nothing to do with household service. "His daughter," Finch said, looking at her with those pale eyes, "has been offered to settle the debt, in the manner of marriage." The crowd went very still. Then someone laughed. A single person, somewhere to her left, and like a fire catching, others followed. Clementine stood in the center of it and did not move. She had learned, in 24 years, that moving during a moment like this was an admission of something. She did not know exactly what, but she stood still, hands at her sides, and she looked at Jeremiah Finch, and she did not cry, though the backs of her eyes burned with the effort. "I have no interest," Finch continued, "in taking Miss Caldwell as a wife." He said this the way a man says he has no interest in a horse with a broken leg, plainly, clinically, as a simple statement of obvious fact. "But I thought it appropriate that the town understand the nature of what this family has come to." He smiled. A father so desperate he'd offer his daughter like a trade good. More laughter. Someone near the back said something she couldn't quite hear, but she heard enough. The word fat, clipped and clean like a stone thrown in her direction, and the laughter that followed it was of a different quality. Crueler. More comfortable. Her father still wasn't looking at her. Finch was still talking. She had stopped fully hearing him. She was aware of the heat in her face, the way the crowd formed a kind of circle around her without meaning to, the way children at the edges stared openly while their mothers pretended not to. She was thinking, with the strange calm of complete despair, that she had nowhere to go, that this was the end of something, though she could not have said what, that the blue cotton dress with the crooked collar seam was still on her work table at home, and Mrs. Alderman would come at noon and there would be no one there to give it to her. And that was the thought that almost broke her. Not the laughter, not the crowd, not her father's refusal to look up, but the unfinished work sitting alone on the table. The church doors opened. Not dramatically, not with a bang. They simply swung inward, the way doors do when the latch is released. But the sound of them cut through Finch's voice and through the laughter, and the crowd turned toward the sound without thinking. The man who stepped through them was large in a way that registered before anything else did. Not fat, not soft, but built the way a thing is built when it has spent years fighting a hard environment, and the environment has not won. He was perhaps 35, though the lines on his face made that difficult to say with certainty. He carried scars the way some men carry good looks, prominently, without apology. One ran from his left temple down the side of his jaw. Another crossed his forearm, visible below his rolled sleeve. His clothing was clean but rough. His boots had seen real ground. He had dark hair, several days past, needing a cut, and dark eyes that moved over the crowd the way a man's eyes move when he has learned to read situations fast, because his life has occasionally depended on it. Clementine did not know him. She was certain of that. He looked at the crowd. He looked at Finch. Then he looked at her. She had the strangest feeling. Not comfort, not hope, nothing as simple as that. Just recognition, like being looked at by someone who was actually looking rather than cataloging. Gideon Hayes, someone in the crowd said, in a low voice that carried. She heard the slight shift in the crowd's posture. Hayes. The mountain man from up near the North Ridge. She'd heard the name the way you hear names in a small town, without meaning to, from context. He came down twice a year for supplies. He spoke to nobody if he could help it. He lived alone and intended to continue doing so, and the town took this as evidence of something wrong with him. Gideon Hayes walked down the church steps and across the open space between the crowd and where Finch stood, and he did it without hurrying, which meant everyone had to watch him do it. He stopped a few feet from Finch. "I heard enough from outside," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. Flat. Not angry, which somehow was more frightening than anger. "You're trying to collect a debt." Finch regarded him with the particular disdain of a man who controls money looking at a man who does not. "This isn't your business, Hayes." "How much is the debt?" Finch blinked. "I said this is not—" "I heard what you said." Hayes looked at him without blinking. "I asked how much." A silence settled over the crowd that was different from the silence before, less comfortable, less certain of how it would end. Finch told him the number. He said it with contempt, the way you say a number you believe no one present can match. Gideon Hayes reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a leather pouch. He set it on the stone railing of the church steps. The sound it made was heavy. "That's gold dust," Hayes said. "Weighed this morning. There's enough to cover the debt, and then some. You can have someone verify it." The crowd had gone completely silent. Finch stared at the pouch. Then he looked up at Hayes. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" "Paying a debt," Hayes said. He turned then, not to Finch, but to Clementine. He looked at her directly. Not the way men in town looked at her, which was either with pity or with the careful blankness of people pretending they didn't see something unpleasant. He looked at her the way a person looks at another person they intend to speak to honestly. "Miss Caldwell," he said, "my name is Gideon Hayes. I have a homestead up near Whisper Ridge. It's not easy land and it's not easy living, and I won't dress it up as something it isn't." He paused. I'm not looking for a servant. I'm not doing this for your father's sake or to make a point to anyone in this crowd." He stopped again, seeming to search for the right words, and she had the feeling he was a man who generally chose his words carefully because he used so few of them. "I'm 36 years old, and I live alone, and I believe you've been treated in a way that no person ought to be treated. I'm asking if you'd be willing to come up the mountain with me, as my wife, if you choose to." The words "if you choose to" landed differently than anything else had that morning. The crowd began to murmur. Clementine looked at this man, this stranger with his scars and his rough coat and his leather pouch of gold that he'd placed on a church railing like it was nothing, and she understood that she was being asked, not told, that there was a difference, that the difference mattered. She was also aware that she had approximately 30 seconds to make a decision that would determine the entire rest of her life. She looked at her father. He was finally looking back at her. His face held something she chose not to spend any more time reading. She looked at Finch, who had the expression of a man whose theatrical production had been ruined by an understudy nobody expected. She looked at the crowd, the women with their careful faces, the men with their crossed arms, the children staring openly. All these people who had laughed at her, who would continue to laugh at her, who would be the air she breathed every day in Oakhaven for the rest of her life if she stayed. She looked at Gideon Hayes. "Yes," she said, not loudly, but clearly. His face didn't break into a smile, didn't flood with relief. He simply nodded, once, the way a man nods when something has been decided and the next step is to act on it. He picked up the leather pouch and walked it over to Finch and placed it in the man's hand. "Debt's paid," he said. "You don't have cause to speak to this family again." Finch's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Surprise. Calculation. And then, and this was the one that would stay with Clementine for a long time, a flash of something cold and specific that she recognized even then as a warning. The look of a man who does not accept having his plans rearranged, who will hold this against them, who is already filing it away. But he said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The crowd was watching, and Jeremiah Finch was first and last a man who cared about appearances. And the appearance right now was that he had been outmaneuvered in front of everyone who mattered to him. He took the pouch. He stepped back. Gideon Hayes turned to Clementine. "You'll need your things," he said. "I can wait." "I don't have much," she said. "That's all right." He said it without condescension, simply as a fact that required no elaboration. She turned and walked back through the crowd, which parted for her now, partly from shock, partly from something else she couldn't name. Nobody said anything to her. Not her father, who stood where she'd left him, still not quite meeting her eyes. Not the women who'd whispered. Not the man who'd made the joke she'd heard from the back of the crowd. She walked home. She packed a bag. She included the blue cotton dress with the crooked collar, and she left a note for Mrs. Alderman explaining the seam and where the work had been left, and that she was sorry for the inconvenience. Then she walked back. Gideon Hayes was standing where she'd left him, which she had not entirely expected. He'd moved away from the crowd. His horse, a solid, heavy-built gray, was tied at the post nearby. He looked up when she came back, and she thought she saw something move across his face. Something that might have been relief, though it was hard to say with certainty. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said. She was not ready. She had no idea what she was walking toward. The man beside her was a stranger with scars and a mountain homestead and a quiet that she didn't yet know how to read. The road ahead was literal and uncertain, and would, she already knew, be hard. She was 24 years old, and she'd just left everything she'd ever known. But when she looked back at the crowd still gathered on the church steps, at Jeremiah Finch's closed, calculating face, at her father's bowed head, at all the faces she'd spent her whole life trying and failing to be acceptable to, she felt, rising up through everything else, something she barely recognized because she had felt it so rarely. It felt like forward. She turned and walked toward the horse, and Gideon Hayes fell into step beside her, and neither of them looked back. The gray horse's name was Bolt, which Clementine learned approximately 20 minutes into the ride when the animal decided to express a strong opinion about a loose rock on the trail and nearly sent her sideways off the saddle. "Bolt," Gideon said, in a voice that was somehow both calm and final. And the horse settled. Clementine straightened herself, gripped the saddle horn with more conviction than she'd like to admit, and said nothing. She was riding behind him, which was the only arrangement that made sense given the single horse, and she was acutely aware of the proximity and the strangeness of it. The warmth of another person's back, the smell of wood smoke and pine resin coming off his coat. "You ride much?" Gideon asked. "Not really," she said. "You'll learn." It wasn't a reassurance, it wasn't a promise, it was simply a statement of what would need to happen, delivered without any particular drama. She found, to her own surprise, that she preferred it to reassurance. The road out of Oakhaven was flat for the first mile, following the line of a creek that had been mostly reliable until 2 summers ago when it ran low, and half the town's farming ambitions ran low with it. She knew this road. She'd walked it every week to deliver work to the alderman house. But the town looked different from the back of a horse, moving away from it. Smaller, less permanent than she'd always assumed it was. She did not look back. She had decided that before they left, and she intended to hold to it. The trail began to climb within the hour, and the climbing changed everything. The trees thickened. The sounds shifted. Less wind, more the particular silence of dense timber where the branches absorbed noise and gave back only the occasional bird and the steady percussion of hooves on hard ground. Her thighs began to ache in a way that was new and specific. She adjusted her position. It helped for a while. Then it stopped helping. She didn't say anything. They rode for a long time without speaking, and she cataloged what she knew about Gideon Hayes, which was nearly nothing. He lived alone. He'd come down to town this morning, presumably for supplies, she now realized, and had ended up in the middle of something else entirely. He had more gold than she'd expected a man in rough clothes to carry. He'd looked at her like she was a person. That last one kept coming back to her. "Why?" she asked, eventually. The word came out before she'd fully decided to say it. "Why what?" he said. "You know why what." A pause. The horse picked its way around a section of trail that had washed out, the footing uncertain. Gideon guided it without any visible tension, just small adjustments of his hands and weight. "I heard him from outside," he said. "Finch." I heard the laugh that came after. "That doesn't answer it." Another pause. Longer. "No," he said. "I suppose it doesn't." He seemed to be working something out. "I've been laughed at," he said finally. "Not the same as you, but I know what a crowd sounds like when it thinks it has permission to be cruel." He paused. I didn't like the sound of it. It wasn't a romantic declaration. It wasn't a speech. It was the kind of honest, unglamorous answer that she'd spent most of her life not receiving, and she didn't know quite what to do with it, so she simply said, "All right," and they rode on. The cabin came into view late in the afternoon, when the light had gone slant and gold through the pines, and her entire lower body had moved past pain into a kind of resigned numbness. She had expected. She wasn't sure exactly what she'd expected. Something rough. Something that confirmed the town's stories about the mountain man who'd gone feral. What she found was a cabin that had been built by someone who understood structure. 2 rooms she could see from the outside. The main room and what would be a sleeping area behind it. The logs were fitted tight. The roof was steep enough to handle serious snow. There was a porch, small but solid, and a lean-to on the south side for storage. A barn, maybe 40 feet back, larger than the cabin itself, which told her something about his priorities that she filed away without judgment. A garden plot, dormant for the season, but clearly tended. She could see the shape of raised beds under the frost. "You built this," she said. It wasn't a question. "Most of it," he said. "First summer was hard, roof wasn't right. Had to pull half of it off and redo it second year." He dismounted and reached up to help her down, and she noted that he did this practically, offering his hand as a steadying point, not making a production of it. She took it, and her feet hit the ground, and her knees nearly buckled from the hours in the saddle, and she grabbed the saddle horn and laughed before she could stop herself. It was the first time she'd laughed all day. Gideon looked at her with something that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. "Come inside," he said. "I'll put Bolt up." The inside of the cabin was Not what she expected, and also exactly what she expected, which was a complicated feeling. It was clean, in the way that a single person's space is clean, when they have no tolerance for disorder, but also no particular eye for arrangement. The table was solid, hand-built, with two mismatched chairs. There was a stone fireplace taking up most of the north wall, with a cook surface built into it. Functional, well-used, faintly ash-dusted at the edges. Shelves along one wall held provisions in an order that was clearly systematic, even if not immediately legible. There was a bear hide on the floor that had seen better days, and a wool blanket draped over one of the chairs that was doing the same. She stood in the middle of the room with her bag in her hand, and the specific reality of where she was hit her for the first time since she'd said yes on the church steps. She was in a stranger's cabin in the mountains. She was, as of this morning, this stranger's wife, or she would be, she supposed, in whatever way the law recognized such things up here. They hadn't discussed that. They hadn't discussed much of anything. She heard the barn door close outside, heard his boots on the porch steps. He came in, shrugging off his coat, hanging it on a peg near the door with the automaticity of habit. "There's provisions," he said, moving to the shelves. "I can cook if you're hungry. It won't be much tonight." "I can cook," she said. He stopped, looked at her. "I didn't bring you up here to be a cook," he said. "I know," she said, "but I'm hungry, and you've been writing all day too, and I've been in kitchens my whole life. Let me be useful." He seemed to consider this for a moment, as if checking it for the trick in it. Then he nodded and stepped back from the shelves. She found flour, salt pork, dried beans that had been soaking in a pot. He'd started them before he left that morning, which meant he'd known when he rode into town that he'd be coming back with supplies to feed 2 people, which meant the decision hadn't been made in a church on impulse, which she thought about for a while without arriving anywhere specific. There was an onion. There were a few late-season potatoes from what she could only assume was that garden. She found a cast-iron skillet that was seasoned within an inch of its life and used it. He sat at the table. He didn't try to fill the silence with words. She noticed this about him, the quality of his silence. It wasn't hostile and it wasn't expectant. It was simply the silence of a person who had spent years with no one to talk to and had made a kind of peace with it. She asked him where he kept the extra firewood, and he told her. She asked about the water, and he explained the pump out back, though he also said he'd bring water up for the night, and he got up and did it without treating it as a favor. They moved around the single room with the careful awareness of 2 people who did not yet know each other's rhythms. She stepped right when she should have stepped left and nearly ran into him reaching past her for a tin cup, and they both stopped, and she was suddenly very aware of how close they were standing. "Sorry," she said. "No harm," he said, and stepped back. She served the food. They ate. The salt pork was better than it had any right to be, and the beans were thick and heavy and good. Outside, the mountain dark had come in fast and total the way it did at altitude, and the fire cast the cabin in shades of amber. "I need to tell you something," Gideon said. He'd waited until they were done eating. He hadn't rushed it. She watched him put his fork down and look at the table for a moment, and she had the feeling of a man gathering himself to say something that cost him. "All right," she said. "There was an illness," he said. "About 6 years back. I was trapping up near the North Face, and I was sick for a long time before I understood what was happening. By the time I got down to a real doctor, it had done what it did." He stopped. "I can't have children," he said. "I won't be able to." The doctor was clear about it. He looked up at her then. "I should have said that before. I didn't know how to work it into what I was trying to say back there, and I didn't want to make it seem like a transaction, like I was listing out what I couldn't give you before you agreed." He paused. "But you should know." Clementine looked at him across the table in the firelight. She thought about the various things she might say. She thought about how her whole life people had approached her with lists of her deficiencies, open and casual as grocery inventories, and how this man was offering a list of his own not as a weapon, but as honesty. 6 years alone, she said. "Yes." "Because of that?" He was quiet for a moment. "Partly," he said. "Partly because I didn't I didn't see the point in offering a woman a life that didn't include the thing most women reasonably want. He turned his cup in his hands. And partly because I'm not easy to be around, he said plainly. I know that about myself. She almost smiled. You seem easy enough right now. I've been on my best behavior since this morning. This time she did smile. It surprised both of them. I was told for most of my life that I was worthless, she said. Not in those words. In other words. In looks. In the way people decided not to include me in things. She wrapped her hands around her cup. I've been told I was too much in some ways and not enough in others. She looked at him steadily. A man who can't have children and a woman the town threw away. I don't think either of us is in a position to be particular. He didn't smile, but something in his face changed. Some held tension released quietly, like a knot working loose. That's more pragmatic than I expected, he said. I'm a practical person, she said. I've had to be. He nodded. I expect we'll figure the rest out as we go. I expect we will, she said. They cleared the table together. He banked the fire for the night. There was a sleeping area separated from the main room by a heavy curtain, and she understood without needing to discuss it that he would take the main room and she would take the back, and this arrangement suited them both just now. She lay on the narrow bed in the dark. A real bed, she noticed, with a proper frame and a straw mattress that was fresh enough to suggest he'd replaced it recently, which was another detail she filed without comment. And she listened to the mountain settle around her. The wind was high up in the pines. Something moved in the dark outside, animal and unhurried. The fire in the other room ticked and shifted. She had no idea what came next. That had been true in Oakhaven too, she realized. She'd had no idea what came next there either. The difference was that here, for the first time, the uncertainty didn't feel like a trap. She slept. The first week at Whisper Ridge was a kind of sustained assessment of each other, of the land, of what this life was actually going to require. Gideon was up before dawn every day. She heard him moving in the main room, heard the fire catch, heard the particular sound of a man who has been doing the same morning tasks alone for years, and has a sequence he doesn't deviate from. The first morning, she stayed in bed and listened to it. The second morning, she got up and was already at the cook's surface when he came back in from checking the barn, and he stopped in the doorway for just a moment before saying nothing and hanging up his coat. They found a rhythm, not a smooth one. There was nothing smooth about it. There were mornings where they were both tired and short and spoke in words of one syllable. There were afternoons where something needed doing and they had different ideas about how to do it, and nobody gave way easily, because neither of them was built for giving way easily. The third day, he was splitting firewood out back and she was bringing water up from the pump, and she misjudged the footing on the frozen path and went down hard, the bucket going one way and her going the other, and she said a word she'd never said in front of another person. And Gideon, who was close enough to hear it, stopped mid-swing and looked at her. Are you hurt? He said. My dignity is hurt, she said from the ground. Is that all? And my elbow. He set down the axe and came over and helped her up, and she brushed the ice and mud off her coat, and he looked at her elbow where a thin line of blood had appeared through the wool. Come inside, he said. I need the water. Water can wait. He cleaned and bandaged her elbow at the kitchen table with the focused efficiency of a man who had dealt with his own injuries alone long enough to get good at it. She watched his hands. They were large, scarred, rough-knuckled, the hands of someone who had used them hard for a long time. But they were careful. He didn't rush. He didn't make her feel fragile for bleeding. You did this yourself, she said. All those years, your own injuries. Mostly, he said, concentrating on the bandage. A couple times I had no choice but to wait them out and hope. That's a terrible way to live. It worked well enough, he said. Then, better now. He said it simply, like it was just a fact, not something he intended as meaningful. But she heard it anyway. The animals became her first real foothold. She hadn't grown up with livestock. Her father's ambitions had never run to animals because animals required commitment he didn't have. But the barn at Whisper Ridge held 2 dairy cows, a pair of draft horses, a small flock of chickens, and a goat named Margaret who had opinions about everything and shared them continuously. Gideon introduced her to each of them on the 4th day, matter-of-factly, like introducing neighbors. "Margaret bites," he said. "Margaret seems nice," Clementine said. Margaret attempted to eat her coat button. "I warned you," Gideon said. But Clementine took to the animals with a naturalness that surprised her. She liked the lack of pretense in them. The cows wanted what they wanted: to be milked, to eat, to stand in the particular shaft of morning light that came through the east-facing crack in the barn wall. And if you gave them what they wanted, they were honest about their satisfaction. Margaret was cantankerous and hilarious and stole everything within reach, and Clementine found herself genuinely fond of her within 48 hours, which she suspected said something about her character. "You're good with them," Gideon said one evening, coming into the barn to find her sitting on a stool, one of the cows leaning its enormous head against her shoulder in what could only be described as affection. "Animals never told me I was too much of anything," she said. He was quiet for a moment, then, "The town did a number on you." "The town," she said, "was just a concentrated version of everywhere else I'd been." She patted the cow's nose. "You figure out early on that people mostly see what they expect to see. After a while, you stop fighting it." "Did you?" he said. "Stop fighting it?" She thought about it, about the blue cotton dress, about the 4 years of careful work, about standing on the church steps with her chin up. "No," she said. "Not really. I just got quieter about it." He looked at her with that look she was beginning to recognize, the one that meant he was registering something, putting it somewhere. He didn't say anything. He picked up the feed bucket and went to work, and she went back to her cow, and the barn smelled like hay and cold air and animal warmth, and it was, she thought, probably the most comfortable she had felt in years. The first real argument happened on day 9. She had rearranged the provision shelves in the main room, not dramatically, just a reorganization that made more practical sense for cooking, grouping things by use rather than by whatever logic Gideon had originally applied. She had done it while he was out checking the upper fence line, because she had energy and a plan, and the shelves had been bothering her since the first night. He came in and stood in front of the shelves for a long moment. She braced for it. "Why is the salt next to the flour?" he said. "Because you use them together." "I kept them at opposite ends because I use them at different times." "When you cook everything at once, you use them at the same time." "I don't cook everything at once." "I do," she said, "and I'm the one doing most of the cooking." He looked at her. She looked back. "It took me 3 years to figure out a system that worked," he said. "And it took me 10 minutes to see a better one," she said. "I'm not trying to undo your work. I'm trying to be able to find things when I need them." A pause. He was not, she had already learned, a man who yelled when he was frustrated. He was a man who went very still, which was in some ways more unsettling and in other ways more manageable. "Fine," he said. "But the dried beans stay where they are." "The dried beans," she said, "are fine where they are." Something shifted in his jaw. Not quite a smile, but the fight went out of the room. "You're not going to be easy," he said. "No," she agreed. "I'm not." She paused. "Were you expecting easy?" "I don't know what I was expecting," he said, honestly, which she suspected was exactly true. She moved the salt back to the middle of the shelf as a concession. He never mentioned it. She counted this as a successful negotiation. What she hadn't expected, what she was not prepared for at all, was the loneliness that hit her on day 11. Not loneliness for Oakhaven. Not for her father, whose face in her memory was already settling into something complicated she preferred not to look at directly. But a specific ache for things she hadn't thought to name. The sound of a woman's voice, the ordinary texture of being known by someone, the small recognitions of shared history. She and Gideon were building something. She could feel that. But they were building it from nothing, with no shared past to refer back to. And on that 11th day, the weight of how much distance there was to cover hit her all at once while she was mending one of his work shirts at the table. She sat there with the shirt in her hands and felt, for the first time since leaving, that she might have made an enormous mistake. Gideon came in from outside and saw her face and stopped. "What happened?" he said. Not a question with a question mark. A statement that acknowledged something was wrong. "Nothing happened," she said. I'm fine. He pulled out the other chair and sat down. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, across the table, with the patience of a man who was not going to pretend he hadn't seen what he'd seen. The silence stretched out. I don't know you, she said finally, and you don't know me, and that's... I knew that, but today it's louder somehow. He nodded, slowly. What do you want to know? He said. She looked up. What? What do you want to know? He said. About me. Ask. She stared at him. Nobody had ever said that to her so directly. People revealed themselves slowly, reluctantly, strategically. They didn't just open a door and say, walk in. What was it like, she said, being sick up there, alone? He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he talked. Really talked. Not the clipped, functional exchanges they'd been managing, but something with depth to it. He told her about the fever, the weeks he barely remembered, the way he'd understood at some point that he was possibly dying, and the thing that surprised him most was that he was angrier about it than afraid. He told her about crawling to the creek for water on days his legs wouldn't hold him right. He told her about the morning he woke up and realized the fever had broken, and he cried, alone on the floor of this cabin, for about 20 minutes, which was the most undignified experience of his life, and also the most honest. She listened to all of it. Then she told him about her mother, about how her mother had been the only person who'd ever made her feel like her size was simply a fact about her body rather than a moral failing, and how her mother had died when Clementine was 14, and how in the years after she'd watched her father's grief curdle slowly into resentment, and how she'd somehow ended up on the receiving end of that resentment without ever fully understanding how. Gideon listened to all of it. By the time they'd both finished, the fire had burned low and needed building up, and Gideon got up and put more wood on it without making the moment into anything other than what it was. Two people who had needed to say things and had said them. Thank you, she said. He looked up from the fire. For what? For asking. He held her gaze for a moment, then he turned back to the fire. It's easier than people think, he said. Asking. She thought about that for a long time after she'd gone to bed, about how easy it was supposed to be and how rarely anyone had ever done it where she was concerned, about how much of what had gone wrong in her life could be traced back to people who simply never asked. Outside, the mountain wind moved through the pines, and somewhere high on the north face, something, she'd learned enough by now to guess it was an elk, called out once into the dark and then went quiet. She was 24 years old, and she was further from everything she'd ever known than she'd thought she could stand. She was also, she realized with a start, that felt uncomfortably close to hope. Not sorry she'd come. The hope she'd felt that 11th night didn't disappear, but it did get complicated, the way most honest things do when you live close enough to them long enough to see all their edges. Winter came to Whisper Ridge the way it came to all high places, without warning and without apology. One morning she woke to 18 inches of snow on the ground and a sky the color of iron, and Gideon was already in the barn when she came outside, moving through the drifts with the focused efficiency of a man who had done this enough times that the snow was simply a condition of living rather than an event. She waded out to help him without being asked. Her skirts were soaked through by the time she reached the barn door. She didn't go back to change them. Storm's not done, he said, not looking up from where he was breaking ice off the water trough. Could get another foot before dark. Margaret? Clementine asked, because the goat had developed a habit of wedging herself into the smallest possible space during bad weather, which was endearing until it became a problem. Back corner. Already made a nest in the hay I was saving for the horses. Of course she did, Clementine said, and went to relocate Margaret, who expressed her displeasure at length and at volume. They worked the barn together for 2 hours, moving with the kind of unspoken coordination that she realized at some point during those hours had simply appeared between them over the past weeks without either of them deciding it should. He knew when she needed the other side of a task handled. She knew when to step back and let him work alone. It wasn't seamless. They still bumped into each other's rhythms sometimes, still had moments where she moved and he moved in the same direction at the same time, and one of them had to give. But it was real, which was more than she'd expected this fast. They were back inside by mid-morning, both damp, Gideon with a scrape on his hand from the ice on the trough edge that he hadn't mentioned. "Sit down," she said. "It's nothing. Gideon, sit down." He sat. She cleaned and bandaged the scrape the way he'd done for her elbow weeks ago, and she felt him watching her hands with the same quality of attention she'd used on his. When she finished, she didn't move away immediately. He didn't move away either. "We should talk about the roof," he said. "Third panel on the east side. I've been watching it." "Later," she said. "It could be a problem in—" "Later," she said again, and something in her voice made him stop, and he looked at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. "All right," he said. "Later." She moved to the stove and put water on for coffee. Her hands were steadier than she'd expected them to be. That was the week she started teaching herself to read the traps. Gideon ran a trap line on the east face of the ridge. Not extensive, maybe a dozen sets, enough to supplement their meat through winter and produce enough fur to trade come spring. He hadn't suggested she learn it. She'd asked because she'd noticed that the trap line took him away from the cabin for half a day at a stretch in weather that could turn without notice, and she'd watched him come back twice in the past week looking more worn than he should have, and it seemed to her that a second pair of hands that knew what to do was simply practical. He was quiet when she asked. Quiet in the specific way she'd learned to read as him running calculations she wasn't privy to. "It's cold work," he said. "I've noticed it's cold here," she said. "Some of the sets are on rough ground." "I've noticed it's rough here too." He looked at her for a moment. Then, not a smile but close. "You're going to make me say yes, aren't you?" "I'm going to make you see it's the right decision," she said, "which isn't the same thing." He started taking her on the line the following morning. It was, as advertised, cold work. The snowpack on the east face was deeper and less stable than the open areas around the cabin, and moving through it with any efficiency required a kind of legwork that used muscles she had and muscles she was surprised to discover she didn't have. She fell twice in the first hour. Once because a snow-covered root caught her boot, once because she made a poor judgment about the firmness of a slope, and the slope turned out to have opinions. Both times Gideon looked at her, assessed that she wasn't injured, and waited while she got back up without offering help she hadn't asked for. She appreciated that more than she could have explained. He showed her how to read the sets, where the tracks led, what species made what print, how to tell if an animal had been caught and freed itself, or if the set had simply been tripped without a catch. She learned fast. She'd always learned fast, when someone was actually willing to teach her, rather than simply doing things in front of her and assuming she'd absorb it. "You've got a good eye," he said on the third morning, crouching over a set she'd read correctly without prompting. "I pay attention," she said. "A lot of people pay attention and still don't see." She looked at him. He was examining the track, not looking at her, which was somehow the reason she believed him. On the fourth morning on the trap line, she found the blood in the snow. It was maybe 200 yards from the cabin, on a section of trails she'd walked a dozen times now, and it was fresh enough that it hadn't frozen at the surface yet, a dark, wide smear in the white that stopped her mid-stride. "Gideon!" she called. He came back along the trail and looked at what she was pointing at. She watched his face change, not drastically, not the way a frightened man's face changes, more like the way a man's face changes when something he's been watching the horizon for has just appeared. "Mountain lion," he said. "How close?" "Close enough that this is fresh." He scanned the tree line, slow and methodical. "Come behind me." She came behind him. She was not, she would realize later, particularly frightened in that moment. She was alert in a physical way she'd never felt before. All her attention pulled to the present in a manner that left no room for the usual internal noise. She kept her eyes moving the way he'd taught her, scanning from ground level to mid-height the way predators did. They made it back to the cabin without incident, but Gideon stood on the porch for a long time afterward, looking out at the tree line, and she stood beside him. "Does it come near the barn?" she asked. "Not usually," he said. "Usually. But it could." "Yes." "Then we deal with it if it does," she said. He looked at her sideways. "You're not frightened," he said. It was halfway between an observation and a question. "I didn't say that," she said. "I said we deal with it if it does. Those aren't the same thing." He turned back to the tree line. After a moment, he said, "No, they're not." She cooked a dinner of the previous day's catch that night, and they ate it at the table with the fire high. And she told him about her mother's mother, a woman she'd only known through stories, a woman who'd apparently had the same build Clementine had, and the same disposition, and who had, according to family legend, once faced down a debt collector with nothing but a cast-iron pan and an expression that made him reconsider his choices. "Sounds like someone you come from," Gideon said. "I used to wonder how much of her was actually in me," Clementine said. "The stories made her sound so certain, like she always knew what to do. What do you think now?" She considered it. "I think she probably wasn't certain. I think she just moved before the uncertainty could stop her." Gideon set his fork down and looked at her in a way that was starting to become familiar, the way he looked when something she said landed somewhere specific in him. "I'm going to say something," he said. "All right." "You're one of the most capable people I've met," he said. "And I have met people in hard circumstances, so I don't say that without a frame of reference." She looked at the table. The compliment felt unfamiliar in her chest, like wearing a coat that was her size but cut differently than anything she owned. "You don't have to—" "I'm not saying it to be kind," he said. "I'm saying it because it's accurate, and because I think you've been told the opposite long enough that you've started to file it under fact." He picked up his fork again. "It isn't fact." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "The roof panel, east side. You said third one." He understood she was changing the subject and let her. "Third from the ridge beam. We should look at it tomorrow if the weather holds." "Yes," he said. "We should." The weather did not hold. The second major storm of the season rolled in that night with a seriousness that the first storm hadn't had. Sustained wind, temperatures that dropped fast and kept dropping, snow that came sideways rather than down, and collected in the angles of the cabin, with the determined efficiency of water finding its level. Clementine lay awake and listened to it and heard, in the middle of the night, the sound she'd been hoping not to hear. A creak from the east side of the roof. A groan, and then a pop that went through the cabin structure like a shrug. She was up before she'd decided to be, had her coat and boots on, and was pulling the curtain aside to the main room where Gideon was already on his feet. "Third panel," she said. "I heard it," he said. "They couldn't go up in the dark in the wind. That was just death with extra steps. Instead, they moved every provision that was against the east wall to the center of the room, hung an oilcloth from the rafters as a catch below the compromised section, put the milking buckets in a row beneath it, and then there was nothing left to do but wait. The snow came through the gap in a slow, steady sift, like flour through a screen. They managed it. They spelled each other. She'd empty the buckets for an hour while he slept, then he'd take the next hour while she slept on the bench near the fire. They didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say. This was the nature of the place they lived. It was going to do this, and they were going to handle it, and in the morning they'd figure out the repair. Around 3 a.m, during her watch, she was standing with the empty bucket in her hand, hair loose and coat thrown over her nightclothes, snow melting in small, cold drops off the oilcloth onto her hands, when she thought, "I am here. This is my life." And she turned the thought over the way you turn over an unexpected object you found, examining it from all sides. It didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like something she'd chosen, which was different from anything she'd ever had before. Gideon came and took the watch at 4 without her having to wake him. He looked at her face for a moment before she went to lie down. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said, and meant it. They fixed the roof panel the next morning in temperatures that made the work actively unpleasant. Her hands inside her gloves went from cold to painful to numb in stages. And Gideon's face, above the collar he'd pulled up, had gone red and hard-set in the way of a man doing what needs doing regardless of how it feels. The repair wasn't elegant. It was 2 people working fast in bad conditions with materials that were imperfect, doing the best approximation of a fix that the situation allowed. It held. That was enough. Coming back inside afterward, she stood at the stove warming her hands on the side of the kettle, and he stood beside her doing the same, close enough that she could feel the cold radiating off his coat before the room heat reached it. And she thought about what it would take to run this place alone, to do the barn and the trap line and the firewood and the repairs and all of it by yourself for 6 years, while carrying the particular weight of an illness that had taken something irreplaceable from you. She thought about Gideon Hayes alone in this cabin in the dark of a winter, with the oilcloth and the buckets, and no one to spell him at 3 a.m. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "Why this mountain?" she said. "Why so far from everything?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at his hands over the kettle. "After I was sick," he said, "I went back to the town I'd come from, tried to resume, work, neighbors, all of it." He paused. "People knew I'd been sick, knew what kind of sick, knew I couldn't—" He stopped, started again. People have a way of looking at a man differently when he can't do the thing men are supposed to do. Like something essential is missing, like they're not sure if they're looking at a full person or something partial. She understood this so deeply and completely that she had to look away for a moment. "So you came up here," she said. "Up here nothing looks at you with pity," he said. "The mountain doesn't care what you can or can't do. It just requires what it requires." He turned his hands over. That felt honest. "It is honest," she said. He looked at her. "It's all so lonely." "Yes," she said. "It is." Neither of them moved for a moment. The kettle steamed between them. "Not as much now," he said. Quietly. Not a declaration, just a fact, offered the way he offered most things, plainly, without theatrical presentation, like the truth was simply something you said when you had it. She felt something shift in the room, not dramatically, not like a door thrown open, more like a window cracked open just enough to let different air in. "No," she said, "not as much now." She was the one who moved first. She turned from the stove and went to check on the provision shelf, the reorganized one, the compromise one, and started taking stock of what the storm days had cost them and what would need replenishing. She heard him move behind her, going to hang up his coat, going back to the ordinary work of the day. But the air in the room was different. She noted it, filed it carefully, said nothing more about it because some things got smaller when you named them too fast. 3 weeks later, a rider came up the mountain. She saw him from the kitchen window first, a single figure on the trail that came up from the south, moving slow in the way of someone who was not fully comfortable with the terrain and was being careful about it. She watched him for a moment, registering the unfamiliarity of him, and then called into the back room where Gideon was repairing a harness. "Someone's coming." He came to the window, looked for a moment, and she saw his jaw set in the particular way it did when something was wrong. "You know him?" she asked. "No," he said, "but I know that horse." She looked again at the animal, a dun gelding with a white blaze. She'd never seen it before. "That horse belongs to Red Briggs," Gideon said, "who works for Jeremiah Finch." The name landed in the room like a stone in still water. "He sent someone," she said. "He sent someone," Gideon confirmed. He moved to the door, not hurrying, but with the focused economy of motion she'd come to recognize as his version of serious. The rider pulled up in the yard and stayed on his horse, which Clementine noted as a calculated choice. Staying mounted was the choice of someone who wanted to leave quickly or who wanted to appear to. He was young, maybe 20, with the look of someone who'd been given a task he wasn't entirely comfortable with. Gideon opened the door and stood in the frame. "Hayes," the young man said. "Briggs," Gideon said. "Mr. Finch sent a message." "I see that." The young man reached into his coat and produced an envelope, which he held out. He did not get off his horse to deliver it. Gideon stepped off the porch and walked to the horse and took the envelope from the young man's hand. He looked at it. He did not open it. "Anything else?" Gideon said. "Mr. Finch said to make sure you read it," Briggs said. He glanced at the cabin door where Clementine had appeared. He looked away from her quickly. The looking away said something. "I'll read it," Gideon said. "Tell him I'll read it." Briggs turned his horse and went back down the trail the way he'd come. They both watched him go. Inside, Gideon opened the envelope at the table. He put the letter on the table and turned it so she could read it. The handwriting was precise and formal. Finch was not a man who wrote sloppily, even when the content of what he was writing was a threat. The letter informed Gideon Hayes that the property known as Whisper Ridge, claimed under frontier settlement provisions, had been reviewed by the territorial bank, Finch's bank, and found to contain a surveying irregularity that placed the eastern boundary of the claim in dispute. Finch had, the letter indicated, filed the appropriate paperwork with the Territorial Land Office. A hearing would be scheduled. In the interim, Gideon was advised to consider his options. It was written with the smooth confidence of a man who held all the instruments and was simply informing the orchestra of the program for the evening. She looked up from the letter. "Can he do this?" she said. "He can file," Gideon said. "Whether it holds up at a hearing is different. But to pursue it, you'd have to go down to the territorial office, which is in Salton City," he said. 60 miles south. In winter. In winter, he confirmed. She looked at the letter again. "This is the payback," she said, for the church steps." "Yes." "He's been planning this since that morning." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Finch doesn't act in anger," he said. "He files things away and acts when it's most inconvenient for the other person. He waited until we were deep in winter and established up here so that fighting it costs us the most." He folded the letter. "It's a smart move." "It's a coward's move," she said. "Those aren't mutually exclusive," he said. She stood up and went to the window. The trail south was empty now, Briggs long gone with his dun horse and his mission accomplished. The trees stood in their winter silence, unhelpful. "What do we do?" she said. "I go to Salton City," he said. "I find a man who knows land law, and I find out what can actually be disputed and what's paper maneuvering." "When?" "Soon," he said. "Before he files anything else." She turned from the window. "I'm coming with you." He started to say something. "Don't," she said. He closed his mouth. "The cabin can be secured for a few days. The animals can be managed with what we have. And I'm not sitting up here alone while you ride 60 miles through winter terrain and then deal with Jeremiah Finch's lawyers." She met his eyes. "I'm not a person who stays behind, Gideon. You should understand that about me by now." He looked at her for a long moment. "I do understand it," he said. "I was going to say the east fence needs to be checked before we leave, and I'll need your help with it." She blinked. "Oh," she said. Something that was definitely, this time, a smile moved across his face and was gone. "Did you think I was going to argue?" he said. "People usually argue," she said. "I'm not usually people," he said, and got up to put his coat back on. She stood in the middle of the cabin with Finch's letter on the table between her and the door, and she thought about the cold satisfaction on Finch's face in that letter. The precision of the threat, the timing, the reminder that he was a man who played long games and played them well. She thought about the girl who'd stood on those church steps with her hands at her sides, burning behind the eyes, holding still because she hadn't known what else to do. And then she thought about who she was now, 8 weeks into a mountain winter, with rope burns on her hands from the fence work, and Margaret's hoof prints on her best coat, and the knowledge of how to read a trap set in snow, and the feel of Gideon's back warm and solid in front of her on the trail. She picked up the letter. She folded it precisely. She put it in the pocket of her coat. Let Jeremiah Finch file his paperwork. Let him schedule his hearings. Let him sit in his warm Oak Haven office and move his pieces around his board with his banker's fingers. They would go to Salton City. They would find their answers. They would come back to this mountain. And whatever Finch had planned for them, he had made one miscalculation she suspected he was going to find significant. He had planned it for the person she used to be. The ride to Salton City took 2.5 days in winter conditions, which meant 2 nights on the trail and 1 morning where the temperature dropped far enough that ice formed on the inside of the tent flap, and Clementine woke with her breath coming out in clouds and the particular stiffness of a body that had spent the night fighting cold even in sleep. She didn't complain about any of it, neither did Gideon, though she noticed he checked on her more than he checked on the horses, which she chose to find practical rather than patronizing. They spoke carefully at night around the fire, both tired, both aware that what waited for them in Salton City required clear heads. She'd read the letter 4 more times since they'd left Whisper Ridge, looking for the seam in it, the place where Finch's argument was weakest, where the logic didn't quite close. She thought she'd found something in the language around the survey date, but she was not a lawyer and the limits of what she knew were real. "Tell me about the original claim," she said the second night, when the fire had settled into coals and the horses were quiet behind them. "How you filed it?" Gideon looked into the fire. "First year I was up there. I went through the territorial office in Salton City, filed the homestead claim the right way. Acreage, boundaries, the creek as the eastern marker. I have the original paperwork." "You brought it." "Inside coat pocket," he said. "Good." She pulled her blanket tighter. "Finch's letter says the eastern boundary is in dispute. If the creek is your marker and the creek hasn't moved, creeks move," he said. "That's what he's banking on. Seasonal shift. He'll argue the creek's current course puts the actual boundary 100 yards further west than it was when I filed, which would put my barn inside the disputed section." She stared at him. "He's been up there," she said. "Or someone has. Someone measured." "Had to have," Gideon said. She thought about that. About someone moving through the mountain in the weeks since they'd been there, measuring, calculating, building a case, about the patience that required, the long game that Finch played so well. "He wants the land or he wants us gone?" she asked. "Gold deposits on the east face," Gideon said quietly. "3 years ago I found color in the creek bed, small amounts, never pursued it." She absorbed this. "He knows. Briggs comes up to trade sometimes in summer. I should have been more careful." He turned the fire with a stick, not looking at her. "I got comfortable." "You didn't do anything wrong," she said. "I underestimated him." "That's not the same as wrong," she said. "That's just something we fix." He looked at her across the fire, and she saw something in his face she was learning to recognize, the moment when he accepted something instead of continuing to argue it with himself. "You sound certain," he said. "I'm not certain," she said, "but I've discovered that moving like you are tends to produce better results than freezing." He almost smiled. Almost. The fire popped between them. "Your grandmother's trick," he said. "Cast iron pan optional," she said. Salton City was bigger than Oakhaven by a factor of 3, which meant it had 2 hotels, a proper courthouse building, 4 saloons, a telegraph office, and a land registry that occupied the eastern half of the courthouse's ground floor. It also had enough strangers that nobody looked at Clementine and Gideon when they rode in. Nobody knew their story. Nobody had an opinion already formed about who they were or what they deserved. And she felt the anonymity like taking off a coat she'd been wearing so long she'd forgotten how heavy it was. They found a boarding house off the main street, clean enough, cheap enough, 2 separate rooms which the landlady arranged without comment, and Gideon went immediately to the land registry while Clementine managed the horses and their gear. She met him at the registry an hour later. He was standing at the counter talking to a small man with spectacles and an ink stain on his right cuff that had clearly been there long enough to become part of his appearance. The man was holding a document and frowning at it in the way of a person who has seen something they don't like. "This is my wife," Gideon said when she came through the door, and the ease with which he said it, not performing it, not formal about it, just saying it the way you say a fact, struck her somewhere behind the sternum. "Mrs. Hayes," the man said, nodding. "This is Mr. Eustace Fenn," Gideon said. "He's the deputy registrar." "The filing came through 4 days ago," Fenn said, looking back at the document. "Finch's attorney, a man named Cordell, out of Denver, submitted a resurvey of the eastern boundary claiming creek migration of approximately 93 yards westward over the 12 years since original settlement." 93 yards, Clementine said. "That's what it says." "Over 12 years, she said. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at Gideon. He looked back at her. They'd talked about this on the trail. Specifically, they'd talked about the fact that she'd spent the previous summer watching the creek because the lower banks near the garden had concerned her, and she'd been tracking whether the water was eating at the south side. "Mr. Fenn," she said, "what would be needed to contest the survey?" Fenn set down the document and looked at her over his spectacles. An independent survey commissioned within the contest window, which is 30 days from filing, filed counter-documentation of the original boundary markers. Testimony if the case goes to a hearing. He paused. And a lawyer, ideally, though the law doesn't require one. Where do we find a surveyor in Salton City? She asked. Two of them. Harkins on Depot Street and Mullery up near the north end. Harkins is faster. Mullery is more thorough. How long would a thorough survey of the eastern boundary take in current conditions? Fenn considered. 4 days, maybe 5, depending on weather. She looked at Gideon. Mullery, he said. Mullery, she confirmed. Fenn looked between them with an expression that had shifted slightly, a recalibration of some assumption he'd walked in with. They found Mullery that afternoon. He was a broad man in his 50s who had the look of someone who had spent decades outside in all conditions and had made his peace with every one of them. He listened to what they needed, looked at the dates, looked at his calendar, named a price that was significant but not impossible, and agreed to ride up to Whisper Ridge in 2 days' time once he'd dealt with a prior commitment. I'll need to see your original filing documents, he said. Gideon produced them from his inside pocket, still in the oilskin he'd wrapped them in. Mullery looked them over with the particular focus of a man who read documents for a living and had learned to read fast. Creek is eastern marker, he said. Yes, Gideon said. What's the creek doing now, would you say? Running where it's always run, Gideon said. Near as I can tell. Near as I can tell, Mullery repeated, not unkindly, just registering the qualifier. I can tell you more precisely, Clementine said. Both men looked at her. I've been tracking the south bank since last summer. I was concerned about erosion near the garden. The water hasn't moved more than 4 or 5 yards in the section I watched, and it moved east, not west, with the snowmelt. She paused. I wrote it down. I kept a record. Mullery looked at her for a moment. You kept a written record of creek movement. I keep records of things I'm watching, she said. It's a habit. He looked at Gideon. Your wife keeps records. She keeps records, Gideon said, with an evenness that somehow communicated both pride and the complete absence of surprise. That, Mullery said, handing back the documents, is going to be useful. The 2 days in Salton City before Mullery could ride were not idle days. Gideon visited the courthouse and spoke to 2 different men about the legal weight of a resurvey contest. Clementine went to the Territorial Records Office and spent an afternoon going through historical survey maps of the Whisper Ridge area, looking for any prior boundary documentation that predated Gideon's original filing. She found something on the second afternoon that made her sit very still at the records table for almost a minute before she fully understood what she was looking at. There was an earlier survey, not of Gideon's land specifically, but of the entire Northern Ridge section, conducted 8 years before Gideon had filed. A territorial mapping survey, the kind done to establish general land characteristics before homestead claims were issued. The creek appeared in it clearly, marked and measured, with coordinates. If the creek was in the same position in this survey as in Gideon's original filing, as in the location she'd been watching all summer, then Finch's claimed 93 yards of migration would have had to happen entirely within the 4 years since Gideon's filing, which was not how creek migration worked. She asked the records clerk if she could have the map copied. That'll take a day, the clerk said. Then I'll come back tomorrow, she said. She walked back to the boarding house in the late afternoon cold, thinking about Finch sitting in his Oak Haven office moving his pieces around his board, about the young man Briggs on the dun horse coming up the mountain trail with his envelope, about the specific quality of cruelty that operated through paperwork and lawyers and land filings rather than fists, how it was designed to make the other person feel that fighting it was impossible, that the machinery of it was too large and too complex to challenge, that the sensible thing was simply to give way. She thought about all the times in her life when she had given way because the machinery seemed too large. She had a map copy to pick up in the morning. She had a surveyor riding to Whisper Ridge in a day. She had Gideon's original documents in an oilskin in his coat. And she had 3 pages of handwritten notes from her own summer of watching a creek do what creeks did. None of it was certain, none of it guaranteed anything, but it was what they had, and she intended to use every piece of it. Gideon was waiting in the small common room of the boarding house when she got back, a cup of coffee at his elbow, looking at the fire with the expression of a man who had been thinking hard for several hours. "There's an earlier survey," she said, sitting down across from him. "Territorial mapping from before your filing. The creek position is documented." He looked up. She told him what she'd found, and she watched the specific change that moved across his face. Not relief, not yet, but the narrowing of the odds from impossible to simply difficult. "How'd you find it?" he said. "I asked," she said. "I asked the records clerk what territorial documentation existed for the Northern Ridge area, and he pulled the boxes and I looked through them." She paused. "People don't usually look through old territorial maps, so nobody bothered to find it before." He was quiet for a moment, then, "You know what Finch thought when he made his plan?" "That we'd be overwhelmed," she said. "That it would be too complicated and too far and too expensive in winter, and we'd negotiate." "Negotiate means settle," Gideon said. "Settle means he gets something." "He gets nothing," Clementine said. "Flat. Certain. Not 1 yard." He looked at her with that look again, the registering look, the putting it somewhere look. And then he picked up his coffee, and something in his posture changed, settled, like a load redistributed. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They rode back to Whisper Ridge with Mullery 2 days later, the surveyor on his own solid horse, and equipped with instruments that he handled with the casual competence of long practice. The ride up was hard. The trail had iced overnight and required careful navigation, but Mullery took it without complaint and arrived at the cabin in good spirits. He spent 2 days on the eastern boundary. Gideon worked with him, carrying equipment, helping set stakes, showing him the original markers that were still in place, cedar posts, partially buried by years of snowpack, but findable if you knew where to look. Clementine spent both days documenting what she'd already documented, writing out her summer observations in clean, organized form that could be submitted as part of a counterfiling. On the second evening, Mullery came in from the east face as the light was going and sat down at their table and opened his field book. "The creek," he said, "is within 11 yards of its mapped position in the 1861 Territorial Survey. In 12 years, the eastern bank has shifted a maximum of 11 yards, and the majority of that shift is directional east, away from your boundary, not toward it." He closed the book. Finch's claim 93 yards of westward migration is not supported by the physical evidence. The fire cracked. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. "Meaning," Gideon said. "Meaning the boundary stands where it always stood," Mullery said. "Your barn is well inside your claim. Your eastern markers are where your filing says they are." He paused. "Meaning someone either commissioned a deeply incompetent survey or commissioned a fraudulent one." "Fraudulent," Gideon said. Not a question. Mullery looked at him for a moment. "That's a word with legal weight," he said carefully. "I'm a surveyor, not a lawyer. What I can tell you is what my instruments say and what the historical record shows, and those two things together don't leave much room for an innocent explanation." Clementine set a cup of coffee in front of him. He took it with a nod. "What we file," she said, "needs to include your survey, the territorial map, and my field notes." "That would be my recommendation as well," Mullery said. "Can the attorney, Cordell, the Denver man, can he challenge your survey?" "He can challenge anything," Mullery said. "Whether the challenge holds is different. I've been doing this for 24 years, and my surveys have been contested 4 times. 0 reversals." She nodded. "We file as soon as we're back in Salton City." They rode back down in 3 days, Mullery going his way, and the two of them going directly to the land registry and then to a lawyer, not the most expensive man in Salton City, but the most methodical one, recommended by Fenn at the registry, a man named Aldous Crane, who wore an ill-fitting coat and spoke in careful, complete sentences and read every document they put in front of him before saying anything at all. He read everything. Mullery's survey, the territorial map copy, the original filing, her field notes. He read it all twice. Then he looked up. "This is a strong counterfiling," he said. "Is it strong enough?" Gideon asked. "Nothing is certain until it's decided," Crane said. "But the fraudulent survey argument, and I'll use that word because the evidence supports it, that is the kind of argument that tends to change the shape of a hearing." He paused, looking at the field notes again. These observations, he said, holding them up. These are yours? Yes, Clementine said. When did you start keeping them? Last July. The bank was beginning to show signs of erosion, and I wanted to track it. Before you received the letter from Finch. 2 months before, she said. He looked at her over the documents with the expression of a man reassessing something. Mrs. Hayes, he said, the fact that these predate the dispute makes them considerably more valuable than if you'd started them in response to it. He set the notes down with a certain deliberateness. People rarely document things before they know they'll need documentation. It suggests either extraordinary foresight or ordinary habit, she said. Yes, he said, which is, legally speaking, better. The counterfiling went in the next morning. Crane handled it, and the clerk at the registry took it with the blankness of a professional who processed paper all day without emotional investment in any of it. Walking out of the courthouse into the Salton City cold, Clementine felt the particular exhaustion of a sustained effort concluding, not finishing, because it wasn't finished yet, but moving into a phase where she and Gideon had done what could be done and the next moves belonged to other people and other processes. Gideon stopped on the courthouse steps. You should know, he said. She stopped beside him. When I rode into Oakhaven that morning, he said, looking at the street, I didn't have a plan. I heard what was happening from outside, and I walked in and I made a decision that I didn't fully think through. He turned to look at her. I thought I was doing something straightforward. I didn't understand what I was bringing you into. The land situation, Finch, all of it. She looked at him. Are you apologizing? She said. I'm saying I didn't know the full cost when I offered it to you. She was quiet for a moment. A cart went by on the street below them. Somewhere a door opened and closed. Gideon, she said, I was standing on those steps with my father not looking at me and a whole town laughing, and you came out of nowhere and you asked me. You didn't tell me. You asked me. She held his gaze. I knew it wouldn't be simple. Nothing in my life has ever been simple. She paused. What you gave me that morning wasn't a perfect situation. It was a choice. That's all I've ever wanted. A choice. He was quiet for a long time. We're going to have a hearing, he said finally. We're going to win a hearing, she said. You don't know that. No, she admitted. But Finch built his case on the assumption that we'd be too beaten down to fight back. And we're not beaten down. She looked at him steadily. So yes, we're going to win. He held her gaze. Then he reached out. Not dramatically, just a hand that came up and touched her face briefly. His rough, cold fingers against her cheek, there and then gone, like a sentence that said something important without needing many words. He turned back toward the street. The horses need feeding before we start back. Yes, she said, and I want to be off the South Trail before dark. I know, she said. She fell into step beside him going down the courthouse steps into the cold air of Salton City, with their counterfiling in the registry and Mullery's survey in Crane's office, and her field notes copied in triplicate the way Crane had recommended. Jeremiah Finch had made his plan for a woman who had nowhere to stand and no one standing with her. Neither of those things was true anymore, and hadn't been for a while now. She'd just needed Salton City to remind her how completely they'd stopped being true. The ride back up to Whisper Ridge took 2 days, and on the second afternoon, when the cabin finally came into view through the trees, she felt something she had no better word for than home. Not the absence of hardship. The roof still needed watching. The east fence still had 1 weak post. Margaret the goat was probably destroying something even now. But a place that was hers, that she had worked for with her own hands, that nobody had given her and nobody could take by simply deciding she didn't deserve it. Gideon opened the barn while she took the horses, and she heard him inside speaking to the animals the way he did. Short, practical sentences, no performance in it. And she stood for a moment in the cold outside the barn door listening to it. Then she went in and helped him with the rest of it, because that was what they did, and had been doing for weeks now and intended to keep doing for a long time to come. The hearing was scheduled for the 3rd week of March, which gave them 6 weeks to wait and a mountain winter that had no interest in making that waiting easy. Crane wrote twice during that period, letters that came up with the occasional supply rider who made the Whisper Ridge run when the weather permitted. The first letter said Finch's attorney Cordell had filed a response to their counter-documentation, disputing Mullery's methodology. The second letter, 2 weeks later, said the hearing examiner had reviewed both surveys and requested Mullery's original field instruments and calibration records, which Mullery had provided without difficulty and which, Crane wrote in his careful sentences, suggested the examiner was already skeptical of Cordell's challenge. Clementine read both letters at the kitchen table. She filed them with the others in the oilskin folder she'd started keeping, next to her creek notes and a copy of the territorial map. Gideon watched her do this the first time without comment, and the second time said, "You're building a record." "I'm always building a record," she said. "I just didn't always have something worth recording." He sat down across from her. "Do you think about it much? The hearing?" "Every day," she said. "Less than I used to." "Why less?" She thought about it honestly because he deserved honest answers, and she'd learned that about him. He wasn't asking to be reassured, he was asking because he wanted to know what she actually thought. "Because I've done what I can do," she said. "The rest is Crane and Mullery and a hearing examiner in Salton City who doesn't know either of us and has no reason to favor Finch." She smoothed the edge of the oilskin. "I spent most of my life worrying about things I had no control over. The way people looked at me, what they said when I wasn't there, whether my father was going to make another bad decision." She looked up. "I'm trying to be more selective about what I give my worry to." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "How's that working?" "Some days better than others," she said. He nodded. That was the honest answer, and they both knew it. The 6 weeks passed the way time passes when you are working hard enough that the days have shape to them. They repaired the east fence properly, both of them working the frozen ground in alternating shifts because no one could swing a post maul in temperatures that low for more than 20 minutes without their hands becoming a problem. They expanded the storage section of the barn, a project Gideon had been planning since the previous spring and that Clementine had opinions about, specifically about the placement of the feed storage relative to the milking area, which led to the second serious argument of their marriage, and a compromise that was, she admitted privately, better than either of their original positions. Margaret the goat achieved a new level of domestic terrorism by discovering how to open the cabin door and was found on 3 separate occasions standing in the main room with the expression of someone who saw no problem with the current situation. "She needs something to do," Clementine said, after the third incident. "She needs to be a coat," Gideon said. "You would never." "No," he admitted. "I wouldn't." There were also quieter things, evenings where the fire burned low and they sat with their respective work, him with harness leather or tool maintenance, her with sewing or her record books. And the silence between them was the kind that had stopped being empty and started being full of something she didn't have a word for yet, but recognized as precious. There were mornings where she woke before him and lay in the gray pre-dawn, listening to the mountain be itself, and felt, with a steadiness that still sometimes surprised her, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because everything was right, not because the life was easy or the future certain, but because she was living it forward instead of sideways, and that was new enough to still feel remarkable. Crane's third letter arrived on a Tuesday in early March, 9 days before the scheduled hearing. She read it standing at the door where the supply rider had handed it to her, and Gideon was behind her in the main room, and she read it twice before she turned around. "The hearing examiner issued a preliminary finding," she said. Gideon set down what he was holding. "Cordell's survey has been flagged for irregularities," she said. "The examiner is recommending the full panel dismiss the boundary dispute claim and refer the fraudulent survey question to the territorial attorney's office." The cabin was very quiet. "Referred for what?" Gideon said. "For investigation," she said. "Of Finch and Cordell both." She watched what that did to his face. It moved through him slowly. Not a sudden flood of relief, but something more like the gradual release of a tension that had been held so long he'd stopped noticing the effort it required. She crossed the room and put the letter in his hands so he could read it himself, because some things need to be read with your own eyes before they become real. He read it. He read it again. He set it on the table. "It's not final," he said. No, she said, but Crane says a preliminary finding like this one almost always holds. The full panel meets in 2 weeks. We should still go, he said. Yes, she said, we should still go. They rode to Salton City for the hearing, which lasted 3 hours and involved Crane speaking in his careful sentences while Cordell, visibly uncomfortable, attempted arguments that had already been undermined by his own survey's discrediting. The hearing examiner, a lean woman in her 60s named Harriet Voss, who had the look of someone who had seen every variety of land fraud the territory had produced and was no longer impressed by any of them, listened to everything without expression, and then took 20 minutes to deliberate. Her ruling was precise. The boundary dispute was dismissed in full. Gideon's original filing stood, unaltered. The eastern markers remained where they had always been. The fraudulent survey was entered into the record as evidence of deliberate misrepresentation and formally referred to the Territorial Attorney's Office for investigation of both Cordell and the party who commissioned the survey. Jeremiah Finch's name was in that referral. In writing, on an official territorial document, Clementine sat beside Gideon in the hearing room and listened to Harriet Voss read the ruling and felt something she wanted to be careful with. Not triumph, exactly, because triumph had a brittleness to it she didn't trust. Something more like the satisfaction of having done the work correctly and having the work hold up. Outside the courthouse, Crane shook their hands. "Well done," he said. "Both of you." "You did the filing," Gideon said. "You brought me something worth filing," Crane said. He looked at Clementine. "The field notes were decisive. I want you to know that. The examiner mentioned them specifically in her deliberations." She nodded. She thought about July, about standing at the creek bank with her notebook, watching the water, writing down what she saw, not because she expected anyone would ever care, but because she paid attention to things, and paying attention felt like the only reliable thing she knew how to do. You never know, she thought, which careful thing turns out to matter. They stopped in Oak Haven on the way home. This had not been the plan. The plan had been to take the northern route that bypassed the town entirely and return directly to Whisper Ridge. But Gideon reined in at the fork in the road and looked at her, and she looked at the southern fork that led into Oak Haven, and they didn't say much. "There's something I need to do there," she said. "I know," he said. They took the southern fork. The town looked the same and smaller, which she suspected was not the town having changed, but her having changed, and the town therefore appearing in its accurate proportions for the first time. The main street, the dry goods store, the bank building with Finch's name above the door, all of it just buildings and dirt and ordinary human activity, no more powerful than she allowed it to be. She found her father at the house on the edge of town. He was on the porch when they rode up, and he saw them coming, and she watched him work through several expressions before his face settled on something carefully neutral. She got off the horse and walked up to the porch. Gideon stayed with the horses. She'd asked him to, and he had understood without needing explanation, which was one of the things she'd come to depend on about him. "Clementine," her father said. "Papa," she said. He looked older. 6 months had done something to him that she might have expected, but still registered with a complicated feeling in her chest. Not pity, exactly, and not satisfaction either, but something that sat between those two things and was probably closer to grief. "I heard you went to Salton City," he said. "We did," she said. "Finch's land claim against our property was dismissed. His surveyor is under investigation by the territorial attorney." Something moved across his face. Surprise, and then, very briefly, what might have been relief, which told her something about how the past months had been for him. "He didn't protect you," she said. "I want to say that plainly. When he made his decision that morning, what he was willing to offer to settle his debt, he chose himself. I don't think I need to dress that up as anything else." Her father looked at his hands on the porch railing. "No," he said quietly. "You don't. I'm not here to punish you," she said. "I'm done being angry mostly. Anger is expensive, and I have things I'd rather spend my energy on." She paused. "But I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen, and I'm not going to come back here and make it easy for you to forget that it did." He looked up. His eyes were wet, which she noted without softening and without hardening. "Are you well?" he said. Up there, are you? Is he good to you? Yes, she said, simply, without qualification, because none was needed. He nodded. He swallowed something. I don't deserve. I know I don't deserve. No, she said, you don't. But I'm your daughter, and I'm not going to disappear from your life over it. I'm just going to be clear about what it was. She held his gaze. If you want to know us, you're welcome to come up the mountain. We have room. The work is hard and the winters are harder, and Gideon doesn't say much, but he means what he says, which is more than most people. She took a breath. But I'm not coming back to Oakhaven to live, and I'm not going to be the person who pretends to be smaller than she is to make people here more comfortable. Her father looked at her for a long time. You're different, he said. I'm the same, she said. I just stopped apologizing for it. She touched his hand once, briefly, not warmly, but not coldly either. A daughter's hand on a father's, with everything that meant and everything it didn't anymore. Then she walked back to the horses. Gideon handed her the reins without asking how it went. She got up into the saddle. They rode back through Oakhaven's main street, and she was aware of the looks. People stopping, noticing, the particular attention of a small town recognizing someone who has been the subject of its conversation. She kept her back straight and her eyes forward, and she felt absolutely no desire whatsoever to be small. Halfway down the main street, she heard someone say her name. She stopped. Martha Alderman, the woman whose daughter's dress she'd been hemming the morning everything changed, was standing outside the dry goods store. She was perhaps 60, well-dressed in the Oakhaven manner, and she had the expression of a person who has rehearsed something and is now deciding whether to say it. Mrs. Hayes, she said. Mrs. Alderman, Clementine said. A pause. On the street around them, a few people had stopped moving. I heard about the hearing, Martha Alderman said. About Finch. She paused again. I want to say, I should have said something that morning at the gathering. She looked at her gloves. What he did, what we allowed. It wasn't right. Clementine looked at her for a moment. The apology was real, she decided. Imperfect and overdue and probably partly motivated by the fact that Finch was now under investigation and his standing in the community had cracked, but real underneath all of that. No, Clementine said, it wasn't right. She let that sit for a moment because Martha Alderman deserved to sit in it for a moment. Thank you for saying so. She turned the horse and kept riding. Behind her, she heard the street resume its sounds, feet, voices, the ordinary noise of people getting back to their day. She didn't look back. She was finding, with practice, that not looking back was becoming easier. Gideon came up beside her as they reached the edge of town. How was it? He said. Hard, she said. Good. Both at once, he said. Most real things are, she said. He made a sound that was definitively a laugh, short and dry and completely genuine. She'd heard it maybe 4 times since they'd been together, and she counted it every time because it was the kind of thing that happened when he'd stopped managing himself around her and was just present, just himself, in the moment. She thought that was the best thing she knew about him. The ride back up to Whisper Ridge took the rest of the day, and the last hour was in the failing light that came early in the mountain spring, not yet warm, but different from winter light in a way she'd learned to read. The pines were the same. The trail was the same. But there was something in the quality of the air that suggested the season was thinking about changing. They reached the cabin as the last of the light went. She went to check on the animals while Gideon started the fire. Margaret, as though aware that a significant day had concluded, was on her best behavior and only attempted to eat Clementine's coat pocket once. Good girl, Clementine told her. Margaret looked at her with the ancient, self-satisfied expression of a goat who knew her own worth. At the table that night, after dinner, Gideon said, I've been thinking. She looked up from her record book. About the east cabin, he said. There was no east cabin. She knew that. The east side of the property was currently a cleared flat section she'd noticed in summer, and thought about several times, the way you think about spaces that seem to be waiting for something. What about the east cabin? She said. I think we should build one, he said. Separate from this one. A bit larger. She set down her pen. For what purpose? He turned his cup in his hands. There are children in Salton City, he said. I noticed them this time more than before. The ones who aren't anyone's. He looked at the fire. I talked to Crane briefly while you were at the records office. He mentioned the territorial orphan placement system. How it works. He stopped. I'm not saying tomorrow. I'm not saying I know how to do it. I'm saying I've been thinking about it. She sat very still. She thought about what he'd said that first night at this table. The illness, the doctor, the clear and certain fact of what he couldn't give her. She thought about how she'd responded. I don't need a perfect man or a perfect life. I need someone who truly sees me. She thought about how neither of them had circled back to that subject in all the months since, both of them carrying it quietly, the way you carry things that are real and painful and not yet ready to be spoken. She thought about 12 children somewhere who had nowhere to belong. The east cabin, she said carefully, would need to be bigger than just one room. He looked at her. If you're going to do something, she said, do it with enough room to do it properly. Something moved across his face. Not the almost smile, not the registering look, but something she hadn't seen before. Something that was wider than both of those things and more exposed. You're sure, he said. I'm not sure about anything, she said honestly. We don't know how it works or what they'll say or whether they'll allow it for people like us, living like we live. She held his gaze. But you said you'd been thinking about it, and I've been thinking about it too for longer than I realized, and I think the fact that we've both been thinking about it means it's worth finding out. He nodded, slowly. Crane would know the process, he said. Crane knows everything, she said. We'd need to write him. I'll write him tomorrow, she said. She picked up her pen and turned back to her record book, and he sat across from her at the table. And the fire held its heat, and the mountain held its silence around them, and this was the life they had. Imperfect and difficult, and built with their own hands from materials that included two people the world had decided it didn't need. The letter to Crane went out with the next supply rider, and the answer came back 6 weeks later. And the answer was that yes, there was a process, and yes, it was possible for people in their circumstances, and yes, it would take time and documentation and the kind of patient, careful effort that Clementine Caldwell Hayes had been practicing her whole life without knowing what she was practicing it for. The east cabin took the better part of that summer to build. Gideon did most of the structural work, and she did the finish work, and there were days that went sideways, a wall that needed to come down and be redone because the angle was wrong, a roof section that fought them for a solid week. One afternoon where they were both too tired and too short-tempered and said things to each other that required an evening of silence and then a conversation to address. And there were days where it came together in a way that felt almost easy, where the work had its own momentum and they moved inside it together like they'd been doing it forever. In the fall, the first child arrived. His name was Thomas. He was 8 years old and had been living in the Salton City placement house for 14 months, and had, according to the matron's notes, not spoken above a whisper since he'd come in. He arrived on horseback with a territorial placement officer, holding a canvas bag that held everything he owned, and he stood in the yard of Whisper Ridge looking at the cabin and the barn and the mountain behind it with the expression of someone trying to decide if this was real. Clementine crouched down so she was at his level. That's Margaret, she said, pointing to where the goat had appeared at the barn door, investigating. She'll try to eat your coat button. It's not personal. She does it to everyone. Thomas looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at Thomas. Then, very carefully, very quietly, Thomas said, Does she eat other things? Everything, Clementine said. She ate a map once. We're still not sure how. Something moved in Thomas's face. Small, careful, the beginning of something. Can I pet her? He said. She'd like that, Clementine said. Probably. Thomas walked toward the barn with the canvas bag still in his hand, and Margaret came out to meet him with the authoritative energy of a goat who considered the property hers and was willing to share on reasonable terms. Gideon came and stood beside Clementine. They watched the boy and the goat negotiate their acquaintance in the autumn light. 1, Gideon said. "One," she said. Thomas was the first. He was not the last. Over the years that followed, and there were many years, and they were not simple years because nothing about what they had built was simple, the east cabin filled and sometimes overflowed into the main cabin, and Gideon built a third structure and then half of a fourth, and the Whisper Ridge property transformed in a way that Clementine sometimes looked at from the high ground above the barn and barely recognized from the cabin she'd ridden up to that first afternoon. There were 12 children, eventually, not all at once. They came in ones and twos over a span of years, each with their own canvas bag and their own careful face and their own particular damage from whatever had failed them before Whisper Ridge. Some of them stayed. Some of them, when they were old enough, went out into the world to build their own versions of what they'd found on the mountain. Clementine tracked all of them, the way she tracked everything, in writing, in her record books, in the notes she kept because she paid attention to things, and paying attention was still the most reliable thing she knew. Gideon was not a natural father in the way the word sometimes implies, patient and warm and instinctively at ease. He was an imperfect one, which turned out to be better. He was consistent in a way that children who'd had no consistency recognized as valuable. He did what he said he would do. He didn't pretend things were fine when they weren't. He showed them how to work, not as a lesson, but because the work needed doing, and they were people who could help do it. And being included in necessary work turned out to be one of the things that most of them had needed most. Thomas, who was the first, grew tall and wide-shouldered and quiet in a way that reminded Clementine of someone she knew well. He learned the trap line and the barn work and the fence repair and eventually learned to build real building with precision and intention by watching Gideon and then asking questions that Gideon answered fully, without condescension. When Thomas was 17, he helped rebuild the east cabin's roof, and when they finished, Gideon looked at the work and then looked at Thomas and said, "That's solid." And Thomas stood up straighter than Clementine had ever seen him stand. She wrote it down. As for Jeremiah Finch, the territorial attorney's investigation took the better part of 2 years, which was the nature of such things. Cordell, the Denver attorney, cooperated with investigators in exchange for leniency, which meant he provided documentation of Finch's instructions regarding the fraudulent survey. Finch's bank was found to have engaged in the survey fraud as part of a larger pattern of boundary manipulation across several land claims in the Northern Territory, all of them targeting homesteaders who, Finch had calculated, lacked the resources or knowledge to fight back effectively. He had been right about that calculation in 7 previous cases. He had been wrong about the 8th. The bank's territorial charter was revoked. Finch was removed from his position, fined a sum that took most of his assets, and banned from operating as a financial institution in the territory for the rest of his life. He left Oakhaven within a year of the ruling, and nobody at Whisper Ridge spent much time thinking about where he went. Walter Caldwell came up the mountain twice in the years that followed. The first visit was awkward and effortful, and everyone involved survived it. The second visit was less awkward. He met Thomas and 2 of the other children and spent an afternoon helping Gideon with fence work, and he and Clementine sat on the porch in the evening without saying much, which was, she thought, perhaps the most honest they'd ever been with each other. He died 4 years after that visit, in his own house in Oakhaven, and Clementine went down for the burial with Gideon beside her, and she stood at the grave and felt the complicated grief of losing someone who had never quite been able to be what she needed, and let herself feel it without dressing it up as something simpler. She was a practical person. She paid attention to things as they actually were. What Whisper Ridge became over the years was not famous. It was not in any newspaper. No one came to write about it or celebrate it as an example of something. It was simply a place where a man who had been told he was broken and a woman who had been told she was a burden had built a life together and opened it to others who had been told similar things, and all of them had found out through the slow and imperfect work of daily living that those assessments had been wrong. Worth is a strange thing. The town of Oakhaven had tried to determine Clementine's worth on a church step on a Sunday morning, the way you might weigh a sack of grain, looking at the outside of it and calling it empty before you've opened it. They'd been wrong in a way they never fully recovered from, because the knowledge of it stayed in the town's memory, passed down through the people who'd been there and their children, as a story about what happens when you confuse someone's circumstances for their character. What Clementine had known, in the quiet way she'd known things before she had language for it, was that worth isn't determined in a moment of humiliation. It isn't settled by a crowd or a laugh or a banker's contempt. It accumulates in this daily work of showing up. For the animals, for the fence, for the roof, for the creek, you track in your notebook because you're paying attention to things. For the child who arrives with a canvas bag and a careful face and needs someone to tell them about the goat before anything else. On a morning in early October, maybe 8 years after she'd ridden up the mountain on the back of a gray horse named Bolt, Clementine sat on the porch of the main cabin with coffee she'd made too strong the way she always did, watching the mountain light come across the ridge. Gideon came out and sat beside her. They didn't say anything for a while. Inside the main cabin and across in the east cabin, the household was beginning to stir. The particular sounds of a large and complicated family waking up, which were not the sounds of a perfect morning, but were absolutely the sounds of a full one. Margaret got into the storage shed again, Gideon said. I know, Clementine said. I heard her at 4. She's 11 years old, he said. She should be slowing down. Margaret, Clementine said, will outlive us all. He made the sound that was definitely a laugh, and she turned to look at him in the morning light, this scarred, difficult, deeply decent man who had walked into a church on a Sunday and asked her instead of telling her. And she thought about the girl who had stood on those steps with her hands at her sides and her chin up and nowhere to go, and felt for her a tenderness that was something like what you feel for someone you love who is no longer in any danger. She was safe, not because the world had become safe, it hadn't, but because she had stopped waiting for the world to decide she was worth protecting and had built something that protected her instead, with her own hands, beside someone who understood the work. The mountain light moved across the ridge, and the household woke around them, and Clementine drank her too strong coffee, and the day began.